Good morning. I'm very happy to be here today talking about what I identify as one of the main challenges for collective bargaining, to become a path to a more inclusive labor law by recognizing and enforcing the rights of voice, collective organization, and collective bargaining for informal workers. This theme has become more explicit and demanding urgent responses with the COVID-19 crisis, the social cataclysm produced by the pandemic, as the ILO General Director recently referred to, includes the precarious working and living conditions endured by informal workers, many of them who continued to work throughout the pandemic, risking their lives, taking care of people, and delivering food. It has also become clear how this precariousness is a consequence of insufficient or lack of protection by law and public policies. Labor law not only mostly excludes and ignores informality, but also has its share of responsibility in the construction of the idea of informality. By building the employment relationship as the focus of its protection, labor law excludes what is not employment and creates a space of absence and anomaly. In Brazil, for example, this exclusion has occurred since the beginning of the systematization of labor law in the 1930s. Domestic work, agricultural work, work on the streets, most of them carried out by Black men and women, were ignored. Workers who were enslaved and freed without any reparation policy, for the most part of it, did not fit into the wage earning and industrial model that forms the empirical field of attention for labor law. They fell into informality, that is, into oblivion. In my talk today, I argue that one essential challenge in this path is to defy the democratic deficit in the world of work, resulting from the non-recognition and non-guarantee of the right to organize, to collective bargaining, and to dialogue for informal workers. I will start by asking, who are these informal workers? Especially from a perspective coming from the South and a perspective from labor law. Second, I bring 3 examples from informal workers' organizations in Brazil. Finally, I draw some implications of the recognition of voice, freedom of association, and collective bargaining rights to informal workers. Labor law still offers little of its institutional tools, freedom of association, and collective bargaining for informal and self-employed workers. The democratization of work restricted to formal work ignores this democratic deficit left by the majority of workers. This is so characteristic of the reality in many countries, for example, as Brazil, as it reflects their colonial and slave-based origins, race, sex, and citizenship discrimination, and mantles their structures. This requires effort and creativity to be overcome. Labor law has been aware of its limitations in protecting these rights for informal workers, and these are good news. We identify 2 basic strategies used in order to turn law more inclusive. One is to recognize employment for those in atypical work relationships that are in a gray zone enlarged by globalization, neoliberal policies, platform work, production chains. This strategy is important, and it has been reflected in court decisions that recognize, for example, Uber drivers as workers or employees, and in Uber itself having to recognize a trade union representing the drivers in UK. But this strategy is not enough. because not all informal workers are in this gray zone. So the second strategy is to affirm that all workers, employees or not, are entitled to fundamental labor rights. While there are employment rights that do not fit in an autonomous work relationship, that there are rights that can apply in any work relationship. Freedom of association and collective bargaining are an example of such rights. For the second strategy to work, it is essential for labor law to embrace a conceptual diversity towards the idea of worker that truly captures all of them who work: formal, informal, typical, atypical, waged, not waged, employees, self-employed. Of course, this diversity will create epistemological consequences, since labor law dominant thinking construct its concepts, principles, classifications from an insufficient idea of worker, of their collective organizations, and of collective bargaining itself. Labor law in most countries only effectively guarantees freedom of association and collective bargaining to employees. This exclusion is historical and in part was reinforced by international labor law. I will give the example of Latin America. Most Latin American states were original founders of the ILO, belying the idea that the organization was created solely by the industrialized Western countries. The ILO, however, despite its stated goal of universality, failed to capture the complexities of work on this continent, especially those arising from colonization and slavery, such as agricultural work, domestic work, and indigenous rights. Romano refers to a differential geography of rights, concluding that although the ILO presents its normative function as a source of universal norms, it has also produced differentiated norms, excluding or guaranteeing a lower level of protection for broad territories and population groups. The universal norms of the ILO that deal with modern waged work that did not correspond to the greater part of Latin America workforce, which was and still is mostly informal. The need for a more inclusive labor law and international labor standards re-emerged in the global north with the intensification of precariousness and fragmentation of work in the post-globalization world. But the discussion there on the scope of labor rights, including of freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, does not cover the complex reality of work in Latin America. In the global south, informality does not only result from more recent precariousness process. It is very old and imbued with poverty. There is also an intersectionality of different factors, such as race, gender, citizenship, class, in the structuring of the labor market and in its division between formal and informal. These traditional informal workers who were already quite vulnerable are now facing additional risks to their livelihood due to the changes brought about by globalization, neoliberal policies, and new technologies, as noted by Sherman, Eaton, and Shane. The composition of informality is also different across the global south and north. Viego, analyzing the 2018 ILO report on informality, notes that in the informal sector, self-employment absolutely predominates in developing countries, 79%. Most informal workers in Latin America are truly self-employed. Street vendors, waste pickers, care workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers, fishermen. Workers in the Global South have, as Scully noted, relied on livelihood strategies that mix wages with various non-wage sources of income since long before the period of globalization. Not all of these workers are poor, but the majority are vulnerable to falling into poverty. Most of them are informal for generations, never having been protected by labor law, never been able to organize collectively, never been able to engage in a process of dialogue. When labor law restricts itself to the formal labor market, or when it discusses its new boundaries to include atypical forms of work, typical only of the global north, it blinds itself for the permanence of these discriminations and reinforces them in the rest of the world. Law is not neutral. It is important that we develop a conceptual basis for the inclusion of new and old informal workers. These workers have been able to organize, as we are seeing in this slide, and engage in dialogue with civic authorities and business, even though they have no rights under labor law. Let me give 3 examples from Brazil. In Brazil, waste pickers have created a national movement promoting the formation of associations and cooperatives and establishing dialogue with public authorities over inclusive waste management systems in many cities. Here we show a waste pickers association in Brazil northeast countryside. They organize themselves despite the many obstacles: lack of money, no recognition of their activity as work, no acceptance of their legitimacy as workers, and here the intersectional discriminations, color, gender, class play an important role. Lack of capacity to access the market in a competitive way, and low qualification. When they do organize, they have been able to make gains. My research shows that waste pickers in associations and cooperatives have been found to enjoy better living and working conditions than their unorganized counterparts. The example of domestic workers in Brazil is another important one. Their trade union movement started in the 1930s. It was only in the 70s, though, that they managed to persuade the government at the time to enact a law guaranteeing a few labor rights. In 1988, the federal constitution finally guaranteed freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining to domestic workers, a right that is still highly ineffective today, despite the negotiation of a few agreements, especially in São Paulo. With the COVID-19 crisis, domestic workers were one of the hardest hit groups. 1.6 million domestic workers lost their livelihood, and informality jumped to 75%. App delivery workers are another example. In June 2020, they organized an unprecedented strike in Brazil called Greve dos Apps. Overworked, exploited, and exposed to the COVID-19, they struggled to have a path for social dialogue with the companies. And their strike was able to give visibility to their movement. They organized in collectivities and not in traditional trade unions. Despite these developments, both domestic workers and app delivery workers continue to work during the social isolation measures. Because of this, they were one of the groups of workers most affected by the disease, as shown in a higher rate of death compared to the average. in general, these workers do not have statutory rights to full freedom of association and collective bargaining, facing important obstacles to be able to organize and to negotiate. Despite this, there is a legal basis in international labor law that guarantees these rights. ILO Recommendation 204 established as structural principles for the just transition from informal to formal economy, freedom of association, collective bargaining, and social dialogue. ILO Conventions 98 and 154 extend collective bargaining rights to all employers and workers. And the Committee on Freedom of Association, in its interpretation of Convention 87, recognizes freedom of association for all workers, including the self-employed and domestic workers. And even though ILO Convention 154 defines collective bargaining as this protected dialogue between workers, organizations, and employers towards the improvement of working conditions and terms of employment, the ILO Committee of Experts has emphasized that the right to collective bargaining should also cover organizations of self-employed workers. And the committee highlights that the collective bargaining procedures applied in traditional labor relationships may not be adapted to the circumstances and the specific conditions of the activities undertaken by self-employed workers. The committee then calls for the responsibility of governments to hold consultations with all the parties concerned with a view to guarantee to all workers, including self-employed, that they participate in free and voluntary collective bargaining. The question then, the Committee of Experts has expanded the concept of collective bargaining. So our question now is no longer whether these workers have the right to collective organization and bargaining. They do have. The question is also how can law and institutions guarantee their organizations and promote their voice. For this, it is time to embrace this conceptual diversity we have referred to. Eaton, Sherman, and Chain, they explain that there is no single right way for workers to organize, but there are a variety of work arrangements. These arrangements require varieties of unionism and collective bargaining. So now let me finish by considering some of the implications of the full recognition of these rights to all workers in the format of strategy, some strategies. To secure that their voice will be heard and that it will count, it is important that these workers are identified as workers and not people performing some irregular activity or an activity without economic value, and that their working conditions have visibility. Governments should ensure that their associations are part of tripartite or bilateral, when there is no employer, participatory mechanisms. To guarantee their organization rights, it is important to policies and regulations to recognize that what we call informal economy is extreme heterogeneous. The standardization of all forms of work and ways of organizing that has been done by labor law with the concept of employment relations, unions, and collective bargaining is not adequate and useful. Different groups of informal workers associate in different ways, in associations, sometimes also informal, cooperatives, collectivities, NGOs, in traditional trade unions, in national and international movements. For their organizations to be sustainable, they might need managerial support and financial funding. For negotiation, it is important the recognition that there are different ways to negotiate through consultation, information, lobbying to legal reforms, negotiation of rights with local and central governments, with business. When there is no employer to negotiate with, local and national governments must assume their responsibility in this process. I will conclude saying that workers' rights to have their voice echoed, the power to organize collectively, to participate effectively in dialogue over decisions that affect them, constitute a basic dimension for the implementation of other rights and of human dignity. Democratization, participation, collective organization, and bargaining must be rights effectively guaranteed to all workers now. Law cannot exclude workers in informal, autonomous, and precarious relationships. The path to a more inclusive labor law must incorporate the needs and vulnerabilities also of all the informal workers from the Global South, who work on the streets, in homes, paid or unpaid, for which different factors related to discrimination based on poverty, color, gender, citizenship, create obstacles for the exercise of these rights. Thank you very much.